She was locked away, labelled mad, her spirit broken. Then the most feared duke in London arrived, and with one command, "She will be my duchess." He shattered her prison, and everything changed. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Daughter. Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw stood in the drawing room, the faded curtains drawn tight against the world outside. The house around her was as empty as the ache in her heart. Though the Ravenshaw estate was vast, it felt like a prison, its walls growing closer with each passing day. The October morning light struggled through the heavy velvet drapes, casting long shadows across furniture covered in dust sheets. Seraphina traced her finger along the windowsill, leaving a clean line through the grime. Even the servants had given up pretending this house was a home. She had woken, as always, in her tower room. The same grey walls, the same narrow bed with its thin coverlet, the same view of the overgrown gardens where nothing bloomed anymore. Her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin had shown her what she had become. A wraith. Too thin, her collarbones sharp beneath pale skin. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, eyes that had once sparkled with life, but now seemed dulled by laudanum and despair. Her dark hair hung limp and lifeless down her back. 24 years old, and she looked ancient. After dressing in another grey morning gown, Lady Agatha insisted she wear grey. As though Seraphina were in perpetual mourning, she had performed her quiet ritual. From the locked drawer in her writing desk, she withdrew Isabella's letters. There were dozens of them, written in her sister's cheerful, looping script. Seraphina touched the worn pages as though they were holy relics. "Dearest Sera, today we saw the most magnificent butterflies in the garden. Sera, you must come quickly. I have discovered a nest of robins. My darling sister, I do not know what I would do without you." Seraphina's throat tightened. 2 years. 2 years since she had heard Isabella's laughter, felt her warm embrace, seen her smile. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Mary, the youngest housemaid, entered with the breakfast tray and the small brown bottle that had become Seraphina's daily companion. "Your medicine, my lady," Mary said, her eyes downcast. The girl never looked at her directly. None of the servants did. "Thank you, Mary. You may leave it." The moment the door closed, Seraphina rose and carried the bottle to the potted fern in the corner, a struggling plant that was nonetheless the only living thing in her rooms besides herself. She uncorked the bottle and poured the laudanum into the soil. 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of clarity slowly returning, of the fog lifting from her mind. 3 weeks of hiding her awakening from Lady Agatha's watchful eyes. The fern seemed to be thriving on its unusual diet. Seraphina almost smiled at the irony. She returned to her desk, her hands steadier than they had been in months. Her mind felt sharper, thoughts less tangled, but with clarity came questions that gnawed at her like hungry rats. "Perhaps I am mad," she thought, staring at the grey walls. Perhaps seeing prison bars where others see protection is the very definition of madness. But another voice, growing stronger each day, whispered back, "Or perhaps they have convinced me of a lie." The thought was dangerous. Seraphina pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beat rapidly beneath her palm. The memory came unbidden, as it always did. 2 years ago, Isabella's bedchamber, thick with the smell of sickness and desperate prayers. Seraphina had been 22, and Isabella only 17, so young, so full of life until the fever came. For 3 days, Seraphina had refused to leave her sister's side. She had held Isabella's burning hand, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, begged God for mercy. The doctor had been grave, his face lined with defeat. "There is nothing more to be done, Lady Seraphina. Make your peace." "No!" Seraphina's scream had torn from her throat like something wild. "Try something else. Bleed her again. Something—" But Isabella's eyes had opened then, fever bright and knowing, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me you will not let grief consume you, Sera. Promise me you will find happiness again." Seraphina had clutched her sister's hand, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Bella. I promise." Isabella had smiled that beautiful, gentle smile, and then she was gone. The sound that came from Seraphina's throat was not human. It was animal, primal, the howl of a creature whose heart had been ripped from its chest. She had clung to Isabella's body, refusing to release her hand, screaming that it was a mistake, that Isabella would wake, that God could not be so cruel. It had taken 3 servants to pull her away. The days that followed were a blur of uncontrollable weeping. Serafina had refused food, refused to leave Isabella's room, refused to accept the finality of death. She had already lost her mother 6 years earlier. Isabella was losing the last tether to love, to family, to everything good in her world. Lady Agatha, her father's second wife, a woman who had married Lord Ravenshaw within a year of his first wife's death, had watched Serafina's grief with cold disapproval. "This display is unseemly," Agatha had declared, her voice sharp as winter ice. Hysterical, dangerous. There had never been warmth between them, but after Isabella's death, whatever civility existed had shattered into open hostility. The physician Agatha summoned a man who owed her money. Serafina later learned had examined her with perfunctory disinterest. "Melancholia of the severest nature," he pronounced. "She may harm herself or others. I recommend immediate intervention." And so the exile began. At first, it had been subtle, confined to her rooms in the London townhouse. Then, when her grief did not conveniently disappear, she was moved to Ravenshaw Estate, far from society's prying eyes. Lady Agatha had crafted her story carefully, for her own safety and the safety of others. Such a tragedy. The poor girl has lost her mind. The rumours spread through London's drawing rooms like wildfire. Violent outbursts, broken mirrors, screaming at servants. A young woman driven mad by grief, locked away for everyone's protection. The reality was far more mundane and infinitely crueler. Serafina's violence had been weeping. Her madness had been asking why God had taken Isabella, why she had been left alone. Her danger to others had been refusing to attend social functions or pretend her heart was not shattered. The laudanum had started as medicine to calm her nerves. "A few drops in the morning," Agatha had said, "to help her rest, to ease her pain," but the doses had increased. Morning became morning and afternoon became 3 times daily. The world had become cotton-wrapped, distant, unreal. 2 years passed in a fog of half-living, of forgetting who she had been before grief consumed her. Lord Ravenshaw, her own father, visited perhaps once every few months. He never met her eyes. His guilt was written in every line of his face, in the way his hands trembled, in his quick departures. But he said nothing, did nothing. He had surrendered his daughter to his wife's control as easily as he had surrendered everything else. "I have become a ghost haunting my own life," Serafina thought, standing at her tower window. But recently, since stopping the laudanum, something had changed. Memories were returning not just of loss, but of who she had been before. Anger was building in her chest, hot and fierce, and with the anger came something she had not felt in 2 years. Strength. Evening fell over Ravenshaw Estate, with its usual oppressive silence. Serafina sat in her tower room, Isabella's final letter spread before her on the writing desk, when Mary appeared at the door. "Begging your pardon, my lady," the girl said nervously, "but I was told to inform you visitors arriving tomorrow, the Duke of Ashford and his party, something about boundary disputes with the estate." Serafina's hands trembled as she set down the letter. Her heart began to race. The Duke of Ashford. She remembered the name whispered in London drawing rooms before her exile. Cold, ruthless, a man who had loved once and vowed never to love again after his wife's tragic death. A man who moved through society like winter itself, beautiful, untouchable, and potentially deadly. "Thank you, Mary," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. After the servant left, Serafina sat motionless, her mind spinning. She had not seen anyone from society in 2 years. What would they see when they looked at her? The mad woman Lady Agatha had created? The broken creature who had supposedly lost her mind? Almost against her will, she stood and moved to the mirror, something she had avoided for months. The woman staring back was a stranger, gaunt, pale, haunted eyes that had seen too much loss, too much pain. But as she looked closer, forcing herself to truly see, she noticed something else, something beneath the grief and exhaustion, something that had been sleeping, waiting for permission to wake. A spark, small but undeniable. "They will see a mad woman," she whispered to her reflection. "They will see what Agatha has told them to see." Her hand rose to touch Isabella's locket at her throat, the one piece of her sister she still possessed. "But perhaps," her voice grew stronger, "perhaps I am more than their labels." It was a small thought, a dangerous thought, But it was hers, and it was real. For the first time in 2 years, Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw allowed herself to wonder, what if she was not the broken creature they had named her? What if she was simply a woman who had been drowning, waiting for someone to notice she was still fighting to breathe? What if tomorrow, when the Duke of Ashford arrived, someone finally saw her, truly saw her, for the first time since Isabella died? The thought terrified her, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and the grief and the 2 years of chemical fog, a voice whispered, "Perhaps it is time to stop drowning. Perhaps it is time to fight." Seraphina touched the mirror's cold surface, meeting her own gaze with something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it. Hope, dangerous, fragile, but undeniably alive. Tomorrow, the Duke would come. Tomorrow, everything might change. Or nothing would, and she would remain in this tower until she truly did go mad. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw went to sleep without the laudanum's artificial peace, and she dreamed not of death, but of possibility. Chapter 2. The Duke of Ashford. Edward Hawke, Duke of Ashford, had built his reputation on ice and stone. At 32, he was known throughout London as the man who had loved once, buried his heart with his wife, and transformed grief into an impenetrable fortress. He stood now in his study at Ashford House, reviewing documents related to a boundary dispute with the Ravenshaw estate, and felt nothing. Feeling nothing had become his particular talent, but it had not always been so. 4 years ago, the birthing chamber, blood, so much blood. Edward had held Catherine's hand as the life drained from her face. Her skin had gone from flushed with labor to pale as moonlight, and no amount of pressure from the doctor's hands could stop the hemorrhaging. "I cannot stop it, Your Grace." The physician's voice had been hollow with defeat. "I am sorry. I cannot stop it." Catherine had turned her head on the pillow, her brown eyes finding his. Even dying, she had tried to comfort him. "Do not let this destroy you, Edward." Her voice had been barely a whisper. "Promise me you will live." He had gripped her hand tighter, feeling her pulse flutter beneath his fingers like a trapped bird. "I promise." But he had lied to her. Even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was dying with her. The child, their son, the heir Edward had prayed for, had lived for only 2 hours. Edward had held the tiny body as it took its last breath, feeling the weight of all his hopes extinguish in that small, failing chest. The double funeral had been a spectacle. All of London society had attended, watching the young Duke, who showed no emotion as 2 coffins were lowered into the earth, one large, one heartbreakingly small. The whispers had started immediately. Cold, unfeeling. Perhaps he never loved her at all. No tears, not a single tear. What kind of man? They say he returned to work the very next day, discussing crop rotations while his wife was barely cold. Edward had heard every word. He had felt every judgment, and he had welcomed them, because anger was easier than grief, and their contempt was simpler than their pity. The truth was that he felt everything, every loss, every moment, every breath he took that Catherine would never take again. He felt it all with such crushing intensity that if he allowed even one crack in his armor, he would shatter completely. So he had transformed himself, poured all his energy into duty, estate management, parliamentary work. He avoided anything that might make him feel. No art, no music, no social gatherings unless absolutely required for business or political necessity. His sister Margaret had watched this transformation with increasing alarm. "You are not living, Edward," she had told him 6 months ago, cornering him in his study. "You are merely existing." "Existence is safer," he had replied, not looking up from his ledgers. "Safer than what? Than feeling? Than being human?" He had finally met her eyes then, and whatever she saw in his face had made her step back. "Yes," he said simply, "safer than that." Now, 4 years after Catherine's death, he had perfected the role, the cold Duke. The man who moved through society like winter itself, beautiful, untouchable, potentially deadly. Society feared him, respected him, but no one truly knew him. He preferred it that way. Loneliness was predictable, safe, until this morning, when Margaret had disrupted even that fragile peace. The boundary dispute with Ravenshaw estate was straightforward enough. Trees had been felled on land, both parties claimed. It required the Duke's personal attention, a matter of property rights and legal precedent that could not be delegated to a steward. Edward's plan had been simple. 2 days at the estate, 3 at most. Resolve the issue with Lord Ravenshaw, return to London, resume his carefully ordered existence. He had been preparing to depart when Margaret arrived at his townhouse, already dressed for travel. "I am accompanying you," she announced, sweeping past his butler. Edward looked up from the dispatch he was reading. "This is estate business, Margaret. Tedious legal matters involving surveyor reports and property deeds." "Then I shall bring books," she replied, her tone brooking no argument. "But I am coming." "Margaret, Edward, you have not left London for anything but parliamentary duties. In 2 years, you barely leave this house. I am not letting you disappear into some remote estate alone." Her voice softened slightly. "Please, let me come." Edward had recognized the futility of arguing. Margaret possessed the same stubborn streak that ran through all the Hawks. Once she decided something, God himself could not dissuade her. "Very well," he conceded, "but do not expect entertainment. The Ravenshaws are unlikely to be charming company." Now, as their carriage rolled through the October countryside, Margaret gazed out the window at the turning leaves while Edward reviewed his documents. He had nearly forgotten she was there when she spoke. "The Ravenshaw family is quite tragic, from what I hear." Edward did not look up. "Most families are tragic in one way or another. Lord Ravenshaw is weak, apparently, completely dominated by his second wife. Lady Agatha, I believe her name is, quite the tyrant, according to Lady Pemberton. I am not interested in gossip, Margaret." But his sister continued, as though he had not spoken. "They say the eldest daughter went mad after her sister's death. Tragic, really. She was apparently quite promising before. Well, before." Something tightened in Edward's chest, an unwelcome sensation he immediately tried to suppress. "What happened to her?" he asked, attempting to sound indifferent. Margaret glanced at him, and Edward had the uncomfortable feeling she had been waiting for that exact question. "No one knows precisely. Locked away somewhere. The stepmother claims she's dangerous. Violent outbursts, they say. Complete loss of reason." Edward stared at the document in his lap, the words blurring. He knew what grief looked like. He knew what it felt like when the world expected you to package your pain into something acceptable, something that did not disturb their comfort. He remembered the weeks after Catherine's death, the way he could barely speak, barely move, the way every breath felt like betrayal that he continued living while she did not. If he had been a woman, would they have locked him away too? Called his grief madness? Drugged him into compliance? He pushed the thought aside, irritated with himself. This was not his concern. The Ravenshaw family's troubles had nothing to do with him. But the uncomfortable feeling remained, lodged beneath his ribs like a stone. Ravenshaw Estate appeared through the trees as afternoon faded toward evening. It was grand, or had been, once. Now it had the air of something slowly decaying. The gardens were overgrown, weeds choking what might have been beautiful flower beds, paint peeled from the window frames, a house that had given up pretending to be happy. Lady Agatha met them in the entrance hall with effusive warmth that immediately set Edward's instincts on edge. "Your Grace, what an honor, and Lady Margaret, how delightful." Her smile was wide but never reached her eyes. She was handsome in a severe way, her dark hair severely dressed, her posture rigid with control. Edward's immediate assessment: this woman was performing. Lord Ravenshaw appeared behind his wife, a man who looked older than his years, distracted, defeated. A man who had surrendered to someone else's will so completely that he had forgotten he once possessed one of his own. They were shown to the parlor for tea, a formal, uncomfortable affair. Lady Agatha dominated the conversation, discussing the boundary dispute with an eagerness that seemed excessive for such a dry topic. Lord Ravenshaw said little, his gaze frequently drifting to the window. Edward found his own attention wandering. His eyes kept drifting to the doorway, though he could not have said what he was expecting. Then he saw her. A flicker of movement in the corridor outside. A woman passing pale, ethereal, moving as though she were trying not to exist. Edward's breath caught. She was luminous even in her obvious distress. Dark hair pulled back severely from a face of almost painful beauty. She wore grey, a shade that washed out her already pale skin, but nothing could diminish the delicate architecture of her features. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes. Those eyes. The most extraordinary green, like light through new leaves. For one suspended moment, those eyes met his. In that instant, Edward saw everything. Intelligence, sharp and undimmed. Pain, deep and raw. Loneliness that mirrored his own. And something fierce, struggling beneath the surface. something that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard they tried to smother it. Lady Agatha's sharp voice shattered the moment. "Pay her no mind, Your Grace. My stepdaughter is unwell, quite mad, I'm afraid. A tragedy, but we do what we can to keep her comfortable." Edward watched as the woman's hands began to tremble, but her chin lifted a gesture of fragile dignity that struck him like a blow to the chest. She disappeared down the corridor like a ghost, and Edward realized he had been holding his breath. "Mad," Lady Agatha repeated, her voice carrying an edge of warning. She was never quite right, even before her sister's death, but after, well, it is a mercy we can keep her here, away from society's cruel judgments. Edward forced himself to nod, to sip his tea, to discuss boundary markers and property surveys, but his mind was elsewhere. He had seen madness. He had stood at its edge himself, in the black weeks after Catherine's death, when he could not remember how to sleep, how to eat, how to continue existing in a world that had taken everything from him. What he saw in those green eyes was not madness. It was a soul drowning, still fighting to reach the surface. That night, sleep eluded Edward entirely. He stood at his guest room window, looking out over the estate. Moonlight silvered the neglected gardens, turned the overgrown hedges into strange, shadowed shapes. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, as though even the stones knew this was not a happy place. Then a light appeared in a distant tower room, a single candle flame, small and defiant against the darkness. A silhouette moved past the window. Her, the woman with the green eyes. Serafina Lady Agatha had used the name once, during their stilted conversation. She was awake, alone, moving through her tower prison while the rest of the house slept. Edward watched for longer than he should. This woman he did not know. This woman society had labeled and locked away. He thought of Catherine's death, of his own drowning grief and how close he had come to being consumed by it. He thought of the choices he had made to close himself off, to transform pain into ice, and how those had been his choices. Choices he was permitted to make because he was a man, a duke, powerful. What choices had she been permitted? He thought of Lady Agatha's too quick dismissal. Lord Ravenshaw's guilty, averted eyes. The way the servants had seemed to hold their breath whenever the conversation touched on the daughter locked in the tower. He thought of Serafina's face in that brief moment, the intelligence in those green eyes, the dignity in her trembling hands, the fierce something that struggled beneath the surface, refusing to surrender. "Mad," Lady Agatha had said, her voice so certain, so final. But Edward had stood at the edge of that abyss himself. He knew the difference between madness and grief, between true instability and a soul that had been broken by loss. What he saw in Serafina's eyes was not madness. It was someone drowning, still fighting to reach the surface, still believing, against all evidence, that survival was possible. He turned from the window, angry at himself for caring, for noticing, for feeling anything at all. He had worked so hard to build his walls, to make himself impervious to emotion. 4 years of careful construction, and one woman with green eyes and trembling hands had created a crack. Edward climbed into bed, pulled the covers over himself, and tried to force his mind into blankness. But as he lay in the darkness, one thought persisted, unwanted and undeniable. What if no one has bothered to throw her a rope? What if she has been drowning for 2 years while everyone watched and called it mercy? He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come, and in the tower, Serafina's candle burned until dawn. Chapter 3. Cracks in the fortress. Serafina had learned long ago that invisibility was survival, but the Duke's eyes had seen her, truly seen her, and that both terrified and thrilled her in ways she did not understand. She woke the morning after his arrival with unusual clarity, no fog clouding her thoughts, no cotton wrapping her mind. For 3 weeks now, she had been pouring the laudanum into the fern instead of down her throat, and each day the world grew sharper, more vivid, more unbearably real. The grey morning light filtered through her tower window. Serafina lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment in the corridor when the Duke's eyes had met hers. Not disgust, not pity, something else entirely. Curiosity? Concern? Why had he looked at her that way? She was the mad Ravenshaw daughter. Everyone knew it. Everyone whispered it. So why had his gaze held not judgment, but something that looked almost like recognition? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Not Mary, but Lady Agatha's personal maid, a woman whose face was as pinched and cold as her mistress's heart. Lady Ravenshaw sends a message, my lady. The words dripped with barely concealed contempt. You are to remain in your chambers until the Duke departs. Do not embarrass this family further. Serafina's automatic response, honed by 2 years of conditioning, was to nod meekly, to accept, to obey. But something had shifted inside her. The laudanum's chemical chains were weakening, her mind was clearing, and yesterday the Duke had looked at her like she was a person, not a problem to be hidden away. Tell Lady Ravenshaw, Serafina said, her voice steadier than she expected, that I will take my breakfast in the conservatory. The maid's eyes widened. But my lady, she said. I know what she said. Serafina sat up, meeting the woman's shocked gaze. The conservatory, please. The maid hesitated, clearly torn between obeying Serafina and reporting this rebellion to Lady Agatha. Finally, she bobbed a hasty curtsy and fled. The moment the door closed, Serafina's hands began to shake. Such a small act of defiance, choosing where to eat breakfast, but it felt enormous, catastrophic, like she had just declared war. She rose on trembling legs and moved to her wardrobe. Usually the maid dressed her, but today she pulled out her own gown. Not grey. She was so desperately tired of grey. Blue. A simple morning dress in pale blue that she had not worn in 2 years. It hung loose on her frame. She had lost weight during her exile, but it was not grey. Serafina fastened the buttons with fumbling fingers and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger, thin, pale, but wearing blue. I do not know who you are anymore, she whispered to her reflection, but perhaps it is time to remember. The conservatory was a cathedral of glass and wild green. Once it had been her mother's pride, carefully tended, full of exotic plants and blooming flowers. Now it was overgrown, neglected, a jungle of untamed growth where vines crawled up the glass walls and ferns sprawled across cracked tiles. But it was beautiful in its wildness, alive. Serafina moved among the plants, touching leaves, feeling the rough bark of an orange tree that had grown far too large for its pot. Sunlight streamed through the dirty glass, and she turned her face toward it, trying to remember when she had last felt warmth on her skin. She had brought a book, Wordsworth's poems, one of the few possessions she had been allowed to keep. She was reading about daffodils when she heard footsteps. Her heart leaped into her throat. Lady Agatha had found her. The punishment would be, but it was not Lady Agatha. Edward Hawke, Duke of Ashford, stood in the doorway, his dark eyes taking in the overgrown space, the shafts of dusty sunlight, and finally settling on her. I did not mean to disturb you, he said, his voice low and careful. I was admiring the architecture. The conservatory is quite remarkable. Serafina's instinct was to flee, to apologize for existing in his presence and scurry back to her tower like the ghost they had made her. But she forced herself to stay, forced words past the tightness in her throat. The conservatory was my mother's pride. Before, she gestured vaguely at the overgrowth, unable to finish the sentence. Before she died, before everything fell apart, before this house became a mausoleum. Edward stepped further into the space, and Serafina noticed he moved carefully, as though approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. An awkward silence stretched between them. Neither seemed to know how to proceed. Lady Margaret mentioned you were unwell, Edward said finally, his tone surprisingly gentle. I hope you are feeling better. A bitter laugh escaped Serafina's lips before she could stop it. Unwell. Is that the phrase society uses now? How kind. Edward looked taken aback by her directness, and Serafina immediately regretted her sharp tongue. Forgive me, Your Grace. She pressed a hand to her forehead, suddenly exhausted. I have forgotten how to converse with people. It has been some time. How long have you been here? Edward asked, not moving closer but not retreating either. At this estate, I mean. 2 years. The words felt heavy as stones, though it feels like centuries. And before that? Serafina paused, debating how much to reveal. But there was something in his eyes, not pity, not curiosity, but genuine interest that loosened her tongue. Before that, I was in London, with Isabella, my sister. She watched him register the past tense, watched understanding dawn on his face. She passed away, he said quietly. Not a question. Serafina nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hand moved unconsciously to the locket at her throat. Edward was silent for a moment. Then, my wife died 4 years ago, in childbirth. The child as well. Seraphina's eyes snapped to his face, and what she saw there made her chest ache. Grief, carefully controlled but undeniably present. The same grief she carried, just buried deeper. "I am so sorry," she whispered, and the words felt inadequate but genuine. "Society expected me to mourn appropriately," Edward continued, his gaze distant, quietly, briefly, "then move on with my life, my duties, as though I had not just lost everything that mattered." He paused, and Seraphina could see him wrestling with something. "I wanted to scream," he admitted, his voice dropping lower. "To rage, to refuse to accept it, to tear apart the world that had taken them from me. But you did not," Seraphina said softly. "No, I buried it. Became what they expected, cold, controlled, impenetrable." His eyes refocused on her. "And you?" "I screamed," Seraphina said simply. "I raged. I refused to accept it." The silence that followed felt heavy with meaning. "And they called you mad for it," Edward said. "And it was not a question." Seraphina met his gaze directly. "Perhaps madness is simply grief that society finds inconvenient." She watched something shift in his expression, surprise, recognition, and something else she could not name. For the first time, Seraphina wondered if this cold duke might understand her better than anyone had in 2 years. Before Edward could respond, a bright voice called from the doorway. "There you are, Edward. I have been looking everywhere, oh." Lady Margaret Hawke entered the conservatory, her face lighting up when she saw Seraphina. Where her brother was dark and reserved, Margaret was warm and open, with kind eyes and an easy smile. "Lady Seraphina, what a lovely surprise. This conservatory is absolutely enchanting. Is it not, Edward?" "Indeed," Edward said, and Seraphina could have sworn she heard amusement in his tone. Margaret swept forward, immediately embracing the moment with the ease of someone accustomed to social situations. "You must tell me about these plants. I am hopeless with growing things, but I do so admire those who possess the talent." Seraphina found herself cautiously warming under Margaret's genuine enthusiasm. "The conservatory was my mother's project. She imported many of these specimens from her travels. This is a lemon tree from Italy, and here she touched a vine with small purple flowers, passion flower from the Americas. How fascinating. And are you a reader? I noticed you have Wordsworth. He is one of my favorites." Seraphina felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. When was the last time someone had asked her about books, about her thoughts, her interests, anything beyond whether she had taken her medicine? "I have always loved poetry," she admitted. "Wordsworth, Coleridge, Blake." "Oh, Blake. The marriage of heaven and hell is extraordinary, though terribly scandalous." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "Have you read Songs of Innocence and Experience?" For 10 minutes, it was simply 3 people talking about poetry. Margaret's enthusiasm was infectious, and even Edward contributed occasional observations that showed his own deep reading. Seraphina felt herself relaxing, the careful tension in her shoulders easing. She forgot to be afraid. Edward seemed to forget to be closed off. It was the first normal conversation Seraphina had experienced in 2 years, and it felt like water after years in the desert. Then Lady Agatha's sharp voice shattered the moment. "Seraphina." All 3 of them turned. Lady Agatha stood in the doorway, her face rigid with barely concealed fury. "Your rooms, immediately." Seraphina's automatic response was a flinch, 2 years of conditioning asserting itself. But she saw Edward stiffen beside her, saw Margaret's expression harden. "Lady Ravenshaw," Edward said, standing to his full height. "We were merely discussing literature. Quite enlightening, actually." Agatha's smile was cold as winter. "Your Grace is too kind, but my stepdaughter requires her rest. She becomes overtired easily." She crossed the conservatory and took Seraphina's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises beneath the fabric. "Come along, child." Seraphina wanted to protest, wanted to pull away, to insist she was not a child, that she had been having the first genuine conversation in 2 years and did not want it to end. But the habits of obedience were strong. She went without protest, though her eyes met Edward's one last time. In that look, shame at being dragged away like an errant child, fear of what punishment awaited her, but also a silent plea. "See me. Remember that I am real." The moment Seraphina was gone, Lady Agatha returned, her performance beginning immediately. "I must apologize for my stepdaughter's behavior, Your Grace." "Lady Margaret." She arranged her features into an expression of sorrowful concern. "She has these moments of lucidity, you see, Brief periods where she seems almost normal, but they never last. Margaret's voice was tight. She seemed perfectly well-mannered to me. Of course she did, my dear. Agatha's condescension was palpable. Serafina can be quite charming when she wishes, but you did not see her after Isabella's death. The violence, the destruction. Edward's skepticism was growing with every word. What precisely occurred? Agatha sighed dramatically. She attacked servants who tried to help her, threw things, broke mirrors, screamed that she wished she had died instead of Isabella, threatened to harm herself. Each lie was wrapped around a kernel of truth, making it harder to discern fact from fiction. We had 3 different physicians examine her. They all agreed melancholia of the severest nature, perhaps inherited madness from her mother's side. Has she been seen by physicians in London? Edward asked carefully. Of course, the finest doctors in England. They all concluded the same: she is beyond help. We keep her here for her own protection, and, I confess, for society's peace of mind. Can you imagine if she were loose in London, having one of her episodes? Margaret opened her mouth, clearly ready to argue, but Edward caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. After Lady Agatha finally left, assured that she had controlled the narrative, Margaret turned to her brother. "That woman is lying," she said flatly. "I would stake my life on it." "As would I," Edward replied, his voice grim. He thought of Serafina's eloquent observations about grief and madness, her knowledge of poetry, the intelligence in her eyes. That was not madness. That was a person trapped, isolated, possibly drugged into compliance. He thought of how Lady Agatha had grabbed her arm, the way Serafina had flinched, the practiced way she had submitted to being dragged away. This was not protection, this was imprisonment. That evening, Edward made an unexpected decision. He found his secretary in the drawing room, reviewing correspondence. "Send word to London. Clear my schedule for the next fortnight. We are extending our stay at Ravenshaw Estate." The secretary looked up in surprise. "Your Grace, the parliamentary session begins next week. Lord Pemberton was expecting your support on the Reform Bill." "They will manage without me," Edward said, his tone brooking no argument. "Send my apologies, but the estate business here is more complex than anticipated." After the secretary departed, looking bewildered, Margaret appeared in the doorway of Edward's temporary study. "You are staying because of her," she said. Not a question. Edward did not deny it. He poured himself a brandy, staring at the amber liquid. "Something is very wrong in this house, Margaret." "Yes," his sister agreed, entering the room and settling into a chair. "That woman is a tyrant, and Lord Ravenshaw is a coward who allows it." Edward thought of Serafina's words. Perhaps madness is simply grief that society finds inconvenient. He thought of her flinch when Agatha grabbed her arm, the trembling of her hands, the way she had looked at him as though she had forgotten people could be kind. He thought of himself 4 years ago, drowning in grief after Catherine's death, but he had made choices. He had decided to bury his emotions, to become cold, to transform into the Duke society expected. They were terrible choices that had cost him dearly, but they had been his choices. Serafina had had no choices at all. "I cannot leave her here," he said quietly. "Not yet. Not until I understand what is truly happening, and if what I suspect is true." He did not finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. "Edward," she said softly, "that might be the most human thing you have said in 4 years." He did not smile, but something in his chest, something he thought dead and buried with, Catherine shifted, cracked, began to wake. It hurt. God, it hurt to feel again after so long in the cold. But as he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, he realized the pain was not entirely unwelcome. Pain meant he was alive. Pain meant he still possessed the capacity to care about something beyond duty and obligation. In the tower, Serafina lay in her narrow bed, replaying the conversation in the conservatory. "My wife died 4 years ago." He understood. He knew what this grief was, what it felt like to be consumed by loss, and he had not looked at her like she was broken. He had looked at her like she was real, like her words mattered, like she mattered. It was such a small thing. In the grand scheme of her existence, one brief conversation in an overgrown conservatory should mean nothing, but it was everything. For the first time in 2 years, Serafina fell asleep not to escape consciousness, not because the laudanum dragged her down, but because she was simply peacefully tired. And somewhere in that sleep, She dreamed not of loss and graves and endless grey walls. She dreamed of sunlight through glass, of words exchanged with understanding, of dark eyes that truly saw her, and did not look away. She dreamed of possibility. Chapter 4. Foundations. Over the weeks that followed, something shifted in the cold halls of Ravenshaw Estate. Two people who had forgotten how to live began, tentatively, to remember. The change was not dramatic. It came in small moments, a conversation extended past politeness, a shared glance that lingered too long. The way Edward found reasons to remain at an estate where he had planned to stay only 2 days. But first, he needed to understand the truth. Week 1. Edward's approach was methodical. He could not simply accuse Lady Agatha of wrongdoing without evidence. Whatever he suspected, he needed proof. His first step was observation. He rose early each morning and walked the estate grounds, noting the rhythms of the household. Seraphina's meals were brought to her tower room on a tray: breakfast, luncheon, dinner. She was permitted brief walks in the walled garden, but always alone, always watched from a distance by one of the servants. The staff avoided speaking to her, not from fear, Edward noticed, but from orders. When Seraphina passed, they averted their eyes, kept their distance, maintained a careful separation. Edward began casual conversations with various servants, gathering fragments of information. The groundskeeper, an older man who had worked the estate for decades, mentioned, "Lady Seraphina used to walk here every morning. Your Grace loved the roses." She did. Then Lady Ravenshaw said it weren't safe for her to be outside unattended. Said she might, well, hurt herself. A young maid, cornered in the hallway when Lady Agatha was out, whispered that Seraphina was given medicine 3 times daily. "Has to take it, my lady does," Lady Ravenshaw insists. But when Edward pressed for more details, the girl's eyes went wide with fear, and she scurried away. Something was chemically controlling Seraphina. Edward was certain of it now. He needed someone he could trust, someone who had been at Ravenshaw Estate long enough to remember what things were like before Lady Agatha's reign. Mrs. Harding, the elderly housekeeper, had served the family for 30 years. She had been there when Seraphina's mother was alive, had watched both daughters grow. Edward found her in the still room, preparing preserves. "Mrs. Harding, I need the truth," he said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Is Lady Seraphina truly mad?" The housekeeper's hand stilled on the jar she was holding. Her eyes filled with tears. "Mad? No, Your Grace. Heartbroken, yes. Grieving, certainly, but not mad." The story tumbled out the truth Lady Agatha had buried beneath layers of lies. After Isabella's death, Seraphina had grieved deeply. She had wept for days, refused food, wanted only to be left alone with her sorrow. But she had not been violent. She had not attacked anyone. She had simply been a young woman, drowning in loss. Lady Agatha called in Dr. Thornbury. "Mrs." Harding said, her voice bitter. A man who owed her money, who would say whatever she wanted him to say. He prescribed laudanum for Lady Seraphina's nerves. Just a few drops at first, but the doses had increased. Week by week, month by month. Within a few months, Seraphina had become docile, compliant, a shadow of herself. "The violent outbursts Lady Agatha describes never happened, Your Grace," she sobbed. She wept for her sister. "Is that violence? Is grief now a crime?" Edward's hands clenched into fists. "Why? Why would Lady Agatha do this?" Mrs. Harding's expression hardened. "Lady Seraphina has a substantial inheritance from her mother, held in trust until she marries or turns 30. She has 6 years yet to wait." The housekeeper met his eyes. "If Lady Seraphina is declared incompetent, Lady Agatha, as her guardian, controls that inheritance." Cold fury settled in Edward's chest. "She is drugging and imprisoning Lady Seraphina for money. I have tried to help her in small ways, Your Grace, but I have no power here. I am only a servant." "You have power now," Edward said firmly. "I need you to ensure Lady Seraphina receives no more laudanum. Can you manage that?" Mrs. Harding's eyes widened. "Your Grace, if Lady Agatha discovers, I will handle Lady Agatha. But Seraphina needs to be clear-headed. Tell Lady Agatha it is being administered, but substitute it with harmless tea. Can you do this?" Hope dawned in the elderly woman's face. "Yes, Your Grace. Gladly." Week 2. Edward needed reasons to remain at Ravenshaw, reasons Lady Agatha could not easily dismiss. The boundary dispute became suddenly, conveniently complex. Edward brought in surveyors to measure and remeasure the land. His solicitor arrived from London with stacks of property documents requiring review. Every question spawned 2 more questions, each requiring careful consideration. Lady Agatha could not object without appearing obstructive, without suggesting she wanted the Duke to leave. That would be terribly rude. Edward and Margaret began creating opportunities to encounter Serafina. Morning walks in the garden, with Margaret serving as chaperone. Afternoon tea in the conservatory, where the light was best. Access to the library, Margaret insisted that Serafina join them, as she needed a woman's perspective on a novel they were discussing. Lady Agatha could not forbid it without insulting a duke, and slowly, as the laudanum left her system completely, Serafina began to transform. Her mind sharpened first. Her responses in conversation became quicker, more confident. The fog that had dulled her eyes cleared, revealing the intelligence Edward had glimpsed that first day. "I feel as though I am waking from a very long sleep," Serafina confessed one afternoon in the library. "The world seems louder, brighter. Sometimes it is overwhelming." "That will ease," Edward assured her. "Your senses are simply readjusting." Margaret, ever perceptive, added, "And you have us to help you navigate the overwhelm." Week 3. Colour returned to Serafina's cheeks. She began to speak more freely, her natural wit emerging like spring flowers after winter. She made an observation about the absurdity of Gothic novels that made Margaret laugh, and Edward found himself smiling, actually smiling at her cleverness. Their conversations deepened. They spoke of loss. Serafina described Isabella's kindness, the way her sister had loved birds and could identify them all by their songs. Edward shared memories of Catherine, the guilt he had carried for surviving when she did not. "I convinced myself that isolation was safety," Edward admitted one grey afternoon as they walked the garden paths. "That if I never allowed anyone close again, I could never be hurt again." Serafina paused by a dormant rosebush, her fingers tracing the bare thorns. "And I convinced myself I deserved isolation, that my grief was a madness that needed to be hidden away. Neither of us was right," Edward said quietly. "No," Serafina agreed, "but perhaps we are learning better now." And tentatively, carefully, they both began to believe in hope again. Week 4. The growing attraction between them became impossible to ignore. Edward found himself seeking Serafina's company not from duty or pity, but from genuine desire. He noticed everything about her, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, the small pause she took before answering difficult questions, the rare, brilliant smile that transformed her entire face. Serafina became hyper-aware of him. His height, the breadth of his shoulders, the way his stern expression softened when he looked at her, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her, so different from the cold tones he used with Lady Agatha. One afternoon in the library, they both reached for the same book, a volume of Byron's poetry. Their hands brushed, and both pulled back as though burned. "Forgive me," Edward said, his voice rougher than usual. "No, Serafina's cheeks flushed pink. "You take it." "Perhaps we might read it together," Edward suggested, and the air between them felt charged with something neither dared name. Margaret observed all of this with knowing satisfaction. One evening, she cornered her brother in his temporary study. "You are falling in love with her," she said without preamble. "I am merely ensuring her well-being," Edward replied, not looking up from his papers. "Edward, I have not seen you smile in 4 years. You smiled 3 times today," all while looking at her. Edward set down his pen. "Margaret." "It is good," his sister interrupted gently. "Catherine would want you to be happy. And Serafina, she is emerging from her own darkness. You are helping each other heal." Edward said nothing, but he did not deny it. Week 5. Lady Agatha had grown increasingly suspicious of Edward's extended stay. One morning, she attempted to reinstate Serafina's laudanum regimen, sending her personal maid to the tower with explicit instructions. Mrs. Harding intercepted the dose and immediately warned Edward. He found Lady Agatha in the morning room, her expression one of false concern. "Lady Ravenshaw," he said pleasantly, "I do hope Lady Serafina is being well cared for. I should hate to hear otherwise." His tone was mild, but his eyes were ice. "I have become quite invested in her well-being." The implication was clear. He was watching. One wrong move, and there would be consequences. Lady Agatha was forced to retreat, but she changed tactics. She began poisoning Serafina's mind instead. "The Duke is merely amusing himself, child," she said during one of her visits to the tower. "Men like him do not marry damaged goods. He feels sorry for you, that is all. When he leaves, and he will leave, you will return to your rooms. Do not delude yourself with foolish hopes." The words found their mark. Serafina, still fragile in her recovery, still learning to trust her own perceptions again, began to doubt. She withdrew slightly from Edward, her responses becoming more guarded, her smiles less frequent. Edward noticed immediately. "Serafina," he said one afternoon when she had been particularly quiet, "have I done something to offend you?" She was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands clasped in her lap. "Why are you here, truly? Why do you spend time with me?" Edward understood at once what Lady Agatha had done. He moved closer, careful not to crowd her but needing her to see his face, to read the truth there. "Because your company brings me peace," he said quietly. "Because you understand parts of me I thought no one could reach. Because when I am with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive." Serafina's eyes filled with tears. "But I am broken. Society says." "Society is wrong." Edward's voice was fierce now. "You are not broken, Serafina. You are grieving, and you have been punished for feeling too deeply. But grief is not madness. Pain is not weakness. And you," he reached out, stopping just short of touching her face, "you are one of the strongest people I have ever known." The moment stretched between them, heavy with longing. Edward cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear. He leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers, the space between them charged with electricity. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, Margaret's voice calling for them. They separated quickly, both breathing hard, both shaken. But something had been acknowledged between them, something that could not be taken back. Week 6. December arrived with the first snow, transforming Ravenshaw Estate into a landscape of white silence. Edward stood in Lord Ravenshaw's study, having requested a private audience. The man looked smaller somehow, diminished by guilt and years of weak compliance. "My lord," Edward began, his voice cold and formal, "I have become aware of certain irregularities in Lady Serafina's care." Lord Ravenshaw went pale. "Your Grace?" I do not wish to hear excuses," Edward cut him off. "I wish to hear the truth. Is Lady Serafina truly mad, or has she been drugged and isolated for other reasons?" A long silence filled the study. Then Lord Ravenshaw's defenses crumbled entirely. "She is not mad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She never was. After Isabella died, she grieved terribly, but she was not dangerous. My wife convinced me that Serafina was a threat to herself, that the inheritance, that it was for the best to keep her controlled, safe." Tears ran down his face. "I am a coward, Your Grace. I know it. I have allowed my wife to imprison my own daughter. I have failed her in every way a father can fail." Edward's disgust was evident, but he kept his voice controlled. "Then you will assist me in correcting this injustice." "Anything," Lord Ravenshaw said desperately. "Tell me what you need." Edward leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into the older man. "I intend to ask for Lady Serafina's hand in marriage. You will consent, and you will ensure Lady Ravenshaw does not interfere." Lord Ravenshaw's mouth fell open. "Your Grace, you would marry her, even knowing what society believes?" "Society is wrong," Edward said coldly, "and I will prove it. But first I must know, will you support this?" Lord Ravenshaw, tears still streaming down his face, nodded. "Yes. God help me, yes. It is the least I can do, the very least." That night, Edward sat at the desk in his guest room and wrote 2 letters by candlelight. The first was to his solicitor in London, a request for complete investigation into the Ravenshaw family finances and Serafina's legal status regarding her inheritance. He needed documentation, proof that could stand up in court if necessary. The second was to the Archbishop of Canterbury, a request for a special license for marriage. He did not yet know if Serafina would accept him. He did not know if she felt even a fraction of what he felt for her. But he knew with absolute certainty that he must ask. In 6 weeks, she had awakened something in him he thought dead forever. Not a replacement for what he had lost with Catherine, but something new, something equally precious. The ability to hope, to care, to love. In the tower, Serafina sat by her window, watching snow fall over the estate grounds. The world was quiet, peaceful, in its blanket of white. She touched Isabella's locket at her throat, her fingers tracing the familiar metal. "I think I am falling in love, Bella," she whispered to the empty room, to the sister she would never stop missing. "Is that allowed? Am I permitted to feel this after losing you? The silence offered no answer, but in her heart, she knew what Isabella would say. She could almost hear her sister's voice, warm and full of life. Yes, Sarah, live. Please, please live. And for the first time since Isabella's death, Serafina believed she might actually be able to. Tomorrow, everything might change. Edward would eventually leave, return to London, resume his life as the cold Duke. Or perhaps, and this thought made her heart race with terrifying hope, perhaps he might stay. Perhaps he might ask her to come with him. Perhaps this was not an ending, but a beginning. Serafina pressed her hand against the cold window glass and let herself believe in possibility. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the dead gardens, the neglected paths, the grey walls of her prison, covering everything in white. Clean, new, a chance to begin again. Chapter 5. The Duke's Demand. Edward Hawke had faced battlefields in his youth, Parliament in his prime, and the death of everyone he loved. Yet nothing had required more courage than what he was about to do, ask a woman who had been taught she was worthless to believe she deserved to be loved. The morning of January's first day dawned cold and clear. Edward stood in his chambers, dressed with unusual care. His valet had laid out his finest morning coat, dark blue superfine that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His cravat was tied in the intricate style favored by London's elite. Everything perfect, everything controlled. But his hands shook as he fastened his cufflinks. "Why am I doing this?" he asked himself, staring at his reflection in the mirror. Was he doing this to save her? No, Serafina was saving herself. He had merely removed some of the obstacles in her path. Was he doing this from pity? No. What he felt for Serafina had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with the way his heart lifted when she laughed, the way her intelligence challenged him, the way her presence made the world feel less cold. Was he ready to love again after Catherine? The fear was there, the terror of losing someone again, of enduring that devastating pain. But yes, God help him, yes, he was ready. A knock at the door. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, as was her habit. "Are you prepared?" she asked, studying his face. "I am terrified," Edward admitted, a confession he would have made to no one else. "What if she refuses?" "Then you will respect her decision," Margaret said firmly. "But Edward, she loves you. I have watched her bloom in your presence these past months. I have seen the way she looks at you when she thinks no one is watching." "She has been taught she is unworthy," Edward said, his voice rough. 2 years of being told she is mad, broken, damaged. I do not know if 3 months can undo that poison." Margaret crossed the room and touched his arm gently. "Then you will spend the rest of your life showing her the truth." Edward's vulnerability showed in his eyes. "What if I fail her? What if I cannot protect her from society's judgment?" "You will not fail her," Margaret said with absolute certainty. "And Edward, she is stronger than you think, stronger than she knows. You have both survived the unsurvivable. Together, you will thrive." Edward nodded, drawing strength from his sister's confidence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, his grandmother's, a simple gold band set with a perfect emerald that matched Serafina's eyes. He had rehearsed what he would say, practiced the words until they sounded right. Then he discarded it all. This could not be a rehearsed speech. It had to be truth, raw and unpolished. "Wish me luck," he said to Margaret. She smiled. "You do not need luck. You need only to be honest." The drawing room felt suffocatingly formal as Edward entered. Lord Ravenshaw sat near the window, looking more defeated than usual. Lady Agatha occupied the sofa, her posture rigid with false pleasantness. "Your Grace," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes, "I trust we can finally resolve this boundary matter amicably. Surely 3 months has been sufficient time." "I am not here to discuss boundaries, Lady Ravenshaw." Edward cut through her pleasantries, his voice cold and formal. "I am here to discuss your stepdaughter." Agatha's face hardened instantly. "Serafina is not. I wish to marry Lady Serafina." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Agatha recovered first, her shock quickly masked by cold calculation. "Your Grace, surely you cannot be serious. Serafina is unwell. She is unfit to be a duchess. The scandal alone." "I have spent 3 months in Lady Serafina's company," Edward said, his voice like ice. "I have found her to be intelligent, articulate, and perfectly sane." Agatha tried a different tactic, her voice dripping with false concern. "But Your Grace, think of your reputation. Society will never accept. I care nothing for society's gossip, Edward interrupted. I care for Seraphina's well-being. She is damaged, Agatha hissed, her mask slipping. You will regret this within a month. She is broken, unstable. Edward stood to his full height, towering over the seated woman. What I have found questionable, Lady Ravenshaw, is not Seraphina's mind, but her treatment in this household. He produced a document from his coat, his solicitor's preliminary findings. The pages rustled as he set them on the table between them. Would you care to explain why Lady Seraphina has been administered laudanum for 2 years without proper medical oversight? His voice was deadly quiet. Or why her substantial inheritance has been used to pay debts accrued by this estate? Lord Ravenshaw made a choking sound. His guilty silence confirmed everything. Agatha's face went white, then red. You cannot prove. I can prove everything, Edward said flatly. And I will, if necessary. But I would prefer to avoid public scandal. He leaned forward slightly. Consent to this marriage, and Seraphina's inheritance remains in the family, hers to do with as she pleases. She may even choose to be generous to her father. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Refuse, and I will expose every detail of her imprisonment and your financial misconduct to every drawing room in London. I will ensure you are ruined socially and investigated legally. Do I make myself clear? Agatha's fury was palpable, but she was cornered, and she knew it. She will refuse you, she said venomously. She is too damaged to accept, too broken to believe anyone could want her. Edward's smile was cold. I will hear Lady Seraphina's answer from Lady Seraphina. Bring her here, now. Seraphina entered the drawing room minutes later, confusion and fear written across her face. She wore a simple grey dress, Agatha's choice, always grey, and her hands trembled slightly. She saw Edward standing by the fireplace, saw Agatha's barely contained rage, saw her father's shame. What is happening? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward approached her slowly, his expression softening. Lady Seraphina, I have something to ask you, but first, I need you to understand several things. He took her hand. Agatha made a sound of protest, but Edward ignored her completely. You are not mad, he said clearly, holding Seraphina's gaze. You have never been mad. You have been grieving, and you have been punished for it unjustly. Seraphina's eyes filled with tears. Your Grace, you have been told you are broken, damaged, unworthy, Edward continued, his voice gentle but firm. These are lies. All of them. You are one of the strongest people I have ever known. You have survived 2 years of cruelty and isolation, and you have not lost yourself. You are still here, still fighting, still beautiful in every way that matters. Seraphina could barely breathe. Why are you saying this? Because I need you to believe it, Edward said. When I ask you to marry me. Seraphina gasped, the room spinning around her. Edward spoke quickly, needing her to understand. I do not offer you pity or charity, Seraphina. I do not offer you rescue, though I will gladly free you from this place. I offer you freedom, partnership, the chance to discover who you might become without these chains. I offer you my name, my protection, and my heart because in the past 3 months you have reminded me how to use it. I ask you to be my Duchess, not to save you, but because when I am with you, I am whole, in a way I have not been since Catherine died. Seraphina's thoughts swirled in chaos. This cannot be real. This is a dream, or a trick, or this is too good. It will be taken away. It always is. But what if it is real? What if I am allowed this? What if? Child, you cannot possibly believe, Agatha began. I am 24, Lady Ravenshaw, Seraphina said, finding her voice with surprising strength. I am not a child. She turned back to Edward, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some elaborate cruelty. Why? She asked. Why would you bind yourself to someone society calls mad? You are not damaged goods, Seraphina, Edward said, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. You are grieving, you are human, and you are the only woman who has made me feel human in return. A pause. Fear and hope warred in Seraphina's chest, tearing her in 2 directions. I am afraid, she whispered. I am afraid I will disappoint you, that I am not strong enough for this, that I will fail at being a duchess, that society will— Then we will be afraid together, Edward interrupted gently. But Seraphina, I am more afraid of a life without you in it. Seraphina looked at her father, who was nodding through his tears. She looked at Agatha, whose face was twisted with impotent fury. She looked at Margaret, standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her smiling face. Then she looked back at Edward, at his steady dark eyes that had first seen her when she was invisible, at his hand, still holding hers with such care, at the vulnerability in his expression that told her this mattered to him as much as it did to her. She thought of Isabella, of her promise to live. She thought of the past 3 months of conversations and laughter, and slowly remembering who she was. She thought of hope, that dangerous, beautiful thing she had thought lost forever. "Yes," Seraphina said, her voice growing stronger. "I will marry you, Your Grace." Edward's exhale of relief was audible. "Edward," he said softly. "Please, call me Edward." Seraphina's lips curved in the smallest smile. "Yes, I will marry you, Edward." The arrangements were made with startling speed. Edward insisted they would leave for London the next morning. "No long engagement," he told Lord Ravenshaw, his tone brooking no argument. "We will marry within a month. I will not risk any complications." His meaning was clear. He would not give Agatha time to sabotage this. That evening, Seraphina packed her belongings, a task that took mere minutes. 2 years of life fit into a single trunk. It was pathetic, really, how little she had been allowed. She found Isabella's last letter tucked in her jewelry box, the paper soft from being read and reread. With trembling hands, she unfolded it one more time. "Dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, I am gone. Do not let grief consume you. Promise me you will find happiness again. Promise me you will live, truly live, for both of us. You have so much love to give. Do not let them take that from you. I love you, always. Bella." Seraphina folded the letter carefully and placed it in Isabella's locket, against her heart. "I am keeping my promise, Bella," she whispered to the empty room. "I am choosing to live." A knock at her door. Edward stood in the doorway, his formal coat discarded, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the chair by her window. She nodded, and he sat. For a long moment, they simply existed in companionable silence. "Are you certain?" Seraphina finally asked. "About this? About me?" Edward considered his words carefully. "Seraphina, I have been certain of very little since Catherine died. I was certain only of duty, of responsibility, of going through the motions of existence." He looked at her directly, and the emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. "But I am certain of this. You have woken something in me I thought dead, not replacing what I lost, but creating something new, something equally precious. I am certain that I admire you, respect you, and am falling deeper in love with you each day. I am certain that I want to spend my life ensuring you never doubt your worth again." Seraphina's tears spilled over, and she could not stop them. "I never thought anyone would say such things to me," she whispered. Edward crossed to her and gently wiped her tears with his thumb. "Then I will say them every day until you believe them." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She did not pull away. Their kiss was tender, tentative, and full of promise, a seal on the future they were choosing together. Seraphina's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart beating as rapidly as her own. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "I am afraid," Seraphina whispered, "but I am also hopeful." Edward rested his forehead against hers. "That is enough. Hope is where we begin." Outside, snow continued to fall on Ravenshaw Estate, covering the dead gardens and grey walls in white. But inside the tower room, for the first time in 2 years, there was warmth. There was hope. There was love, fragile and new, but real. And tomorrow, Seraphina would leave this prison forever. Tomorrow, she would begin to live. Chapter 6. Into the Light. The world outside the carriage window was almost too bright, too vast, too alive. Seraphina had forgotten that life existed beyond grey walls and whispered judgments. Now, travelling toward London with Edward beside her, she was rediscovering colour, sound, and the terrifying possibility of joy. The morning of departure had come with startling swiftness. Seraphina stood in the entrance hall of Ravenshaw Estate with her single trunk, 2 years of life packed into one small container. Lady Agatha had not emerged to say farewell. Lord Ravenshaw had, his face pale and drawn, but Seraphina had merely nodded to him. There were no words left between them. As the carriage pulled away, Edward had expected her to look back at the only home she had known for 2 years. She did not. Serafina kept her eyes fixed forward, on the road ahead, on the future unfolding before her. The journey to London would take 2 days. Edward, Serafina, and Margaret travelled together in Edward's well-appointed carriage, with servants and luggage following in a second vehicle. At first, the sensory assault was overwhelming. The speed of the carriage made Serafina dizzy. She had not moved this quickly in years. The brightness of the snow-covered landscape hurt her eyes, accustomed to the dim light of her tower room. Every sound seemed amplified. The thundering of horses' hooves, the creak of wheels, the shouts of other travellers on the road, the distant peal of church bells. Edward noticed her distress immediately. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her breathing shallow. "Would you prefer to rest?" he asked gently. "We can stop at the next inn." "No." Serafina forced herself to breathe slowly. "I have rested for 2 years. I want to feel everything, even if it hurts." Margaret reached across and squeezed her hand. "It will become easier. Your senses simply need time to adjust." As the hours passed, Serafina found her sister-in-law to be was right. The overwhelming sensations began to settle into manageable impressions. They passed through a small village, and Serafina pressed her face to the window, watching children playing in the snow, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. Merchants called their wares from shop fronts. Women carried baskets, stopping to chat with neighbors. Life, everywhere, ordinary and beautiful. "I had forgotten the world was this full," she murmured. Edward and Margaret exchanged a glance, both struck by the simple tragedy of that statement. They stopped for the night at a respectable inn. The prospect of dining in public, Serafina's first meal outside her rooms in 2 years, filled her with dread. The dining room was crowded and noisy, full of travellers seeking warmth and sustenance. As they entered, Serafina felt every eye turn toward them. Her anxiety spiked, her breath coming short. "They are all looking at me," she whispered to Edward. "They know. They see a beautiful woman dining with her betrothed." Edward interrupted quietly, his hand steady on her elbow. "Nothing more," Margaret added firmly. "And if they stare, let them. You owe them nothing. No explanation, no apology." They were seated at a private table near the fire. The innkeeper, recognizing a duke when he saw one, was obsequious in his attention. The meal arrived. Roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread still warm from the oven, vegetables in butter, and for dessert, apple tart with cream. Serafina took her first bite of chicken and froze. The flavor exploded across her tongue, savory, rich, complex. For 2 years, laudanum had dulled everything, making food taste like ash and obligation. But this was real. This was life. Tears began to fall, and she could not stop them. "I had forgotten food could taste like this," she whispered, embarrassed by her emotion. Edward felt something cold and furious settle in his chest. The depth of deprivation she had experienced, not just isolation, not just chemical control, but the theft of sensation itself, the basic pleasures of being human. He reached across the table and took her hand, not caring who saw. "You will never go hungry again," he said quietly. "You will never be deprived again. I promise you this." The second day of travel found Serafina more present, less overwhelmed. She asked questions about London, about Ashford House, about what her life would be like as a duchess. Edward answered everything honestly, trying to prepare her for the challenges ahead. "Society will be curious," he said carefully. "Some will be kind, others will be cruel. But I want you to understand, you are under my protection now. Anyone who insults you, insults me. And very few people are foolish enough to do that." At one point, Margaret told a story about a pompous lord who had once tried to intimidate Edward at a parliamentary session, only to be so thoroughly demolished by Edward's counter-arguments that he had not spoken in the House of Lords for a month. Serafina laughed, a genuine, surprised sound of pure amusement. Edward turned to look at her, transfixed. Her face was transformed by laughter, all the shadows lifting for a moment, revealing the vibrant woman beneath the grief. "This," he thought, "this is who she is becoming." London, at dusk, was enormous, intimidating, magnificent. As they entered the city, Serafina's anxiety returned. The sheer number of people walking, riding, calling to each other was overwhelming. "So many people," she breathed. "What if they—" Edward took her hand. "One day at a time, Serafina. One moment at a time." Ashford House was a grand London townhouse in Mayfair, elegant and imposing with its white stone facade and black iron railings. As the carriage pulled up, Serafina's heart hammered in her chest. The household staff were lined up in the entrance hall to meet her a formal reception, but their faces were kind. Edward had clearly briefed them carefully. Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, was a woman in her 50s with warm eyes and a maternal air. She stepped forward and curtsied. "Welcome home, my lady," she said. Serafina nearly broke at those words. Home. When was the last time anywhere had felt like home? Edward introduced her to the key staff. Stevens, the butler, dignified and courteous. Anne, who would serve as her lady's maid, young and friendly. Mrs. Patterson, the cook, round and smiling. They all greeted her with respect and genuine warmth. No one looked at her as though she were mad. No one avoided her eyes. Mrs. Hartley led her upstairs to her suite of rooms, and Serafina stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed. It was beautiful. Nothing like her prison at Ravenshaw. Large windows let in floods of natural light. A sitting room contained comfortable chairs, a writing desk, and her breath caught shelves of books. The bedroom beyond held a large four-poster bed with soft linens in blue and cream. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, filling the air with their scent. Serafina stood in the center of the sitting room, slowly turning, trying to take it all in. "This is too much," she whispered. "I do not deserve." "You deserve this and more," Edward said gently, appearing in the doorway. "Please, Serafina, try to accept it." Anne helped her prepare for dinner, drawing a warm bath scented with rose oil. Serafina sank into the water and wept, not from sadness, but from the simple, overwhelming luxury of being warm, of being clean, of being cared for. "Take your time, my lady," Anne said kindly, discreetly leaving her to compose herself. "Everything is different now." The gown Edward had commissioned was soft green silk that brought out her eyes. When Serafina looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Color in her cheeks, light in her eyes. A woman, not a ghost. Dinner was served in the family dining room, intimate, just Edward, Margaret, and herself. The conversation was easy, comfortable, but inevitably turned to the engagement ball planned for 2 weeks hence. "I cannot face all of society," Serafina said, panic rising in her voice. "They will know, they will judge. They will see what I see," Edward interrupted firmly. "A woman of extraordinary grace and courage. And I will be beside you the entire evening," Margaret added. "We both will. You will not face them alone." Edward explained his plan. He would make it abundantly clear that anyone who insulted Serafina insulted him. His social and political power was considerable. Few would risk his displeasure. "Some will be cruel regardless," he admitted. "Society has those who thrive on others' misery, but many will be genuinely welcoming, especially once they see you are not the madwoman Lady Agatha described." The following week passed in a gentle routine that helped Serafina adjust to her new life. Mornings, she explored Ashford House. The library became her sanctuary, 3 floors of books on every subject imaginable. She found a worn volume of Wordsworth and settled into a deep armchair by the window, reading for hours. Edward found her there one morning. Without speaking, he selected his own book and sat in the chair opposite. They read in companionable silence for an hour, occasionally looking up to share a smile. It became their daily ritual, these quiet moments where they simply existed together, no words necessary. Afternoons, Margaret took Serafina shopping. New gowns in colors Serafina had forgotten she loved: rose pink, sky blue, deep burgundy. Slippers embroidered with tiny flowers, bonnets and gloves and shawls, things Serafina had never had at Ravenshaw, where Lady Agatha had kept her wardrobe to grey and brown. "You are not just preparing for a ball," Margaret said as they examined fabrics. "You are reclaiming yourself. Every choice you make, every color, every ribbon, is an act of defiance against those who tried to erase you." Evenings brought dinner and conversation, and sometimes music. Margaret played the piano beautifully and encouraged Serafina to try. "I have not played in years," Serafina said hesitantly. "Then now is the perfect time to begin again," Margaret replied, patting the bench beside her. Serafina's fingers were rusty, stumbling over keys she had once known by heart. But slowly, haltingly, she played a simple melody. Her eyes closed, and Edward watched her face transform, grief and joy mingling as music returned to her life. "You have been buried alive," he said quietly when she finished, "and you are still full of beauty." One evening, after Margaret had retired, Edward and Serafina remained in the music room. neither quite ready to say goodnight. They talked about their upcoming marriage, what it would mean. "I will never control you as they did," Edward promised. "You will have freedom, choice, partnership. Your life will be your own." "I want to be worthy of you," Serafina said softly. "Of this life you are giving me." Edward moved closer, taking her hands in his. "You already are worthy. You always were. Their treatment of you was never a reflection of your worth, only of their cruelty." The air between them shifted, charged with awareness, desire, longing. Edward cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Serafina breathed. Their kiss was different from the tentative one at Ravenshaw. This was deeper, more passionate, full of promise and barely restrained desire. Serafina's hands came up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself as the world tilted. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard, shaken by the intensity. Edward cleared his throat. "I should bid you good night." "Good night, Edward," Serafina whispered, touching her lips with wonder. But neither moved immediately, reluctant to end the moment, to break the spell. The night before the engagement ball, Serafina could not sleep. She stood at her window in her nightgown, looking out over London's twinkling lights, so different from the darkness of Ravenshaw, from the isolation of her tower room. The city sprawled before her, alive and glittering with possibility. A soft knock. "Serafina, may I come in?" Margaret entered in her dressing gown, carrying 2 cups of warm milk with honey. "I thought you might be awake," she said, smiling. They settled by the window, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill. "I am terrified," Serafina admitted. "Tomorrow I will face them all, and they will see me as the mad Ravenshaw girl." Margaret took her hand. "Some will. I will not lie to you about that. But Serafina, others will see the truth, and my brother will ensure that truth is louder than any gossip." She paused, then added, "Do you know what Edward said to me last week?" Serafina shook her head. He said, "Margaret, I have not felt this alive since before Catherine died. Serafina has given me back the part of myself I thought lost forever." Margaret squeezed her hand. "You are not just being rescued, Serafina. You are rescuing him too." Serafina's tears fell, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of hope, of love too large to contain. "I never thought I could have this," she whispered. "Love, home, hope. You always deserved it," Margaret said firmly. "And tomorrow you will show everyone exactly who Lady Serafina Ravenshaw truly is." After Margaret left, Serafina returned to her mirror. The woman looking back was not the broken creature from Ravenshaw Estate. She wore a beautiful nightgown of soft white linen. Her skin had color. Her eyes, though nervous, were clear and bright. She touched Isabella's locket at her throat. "I am doing it, Bella," she whispered. "I am living. Watch me." And somewhere beyond, Serafina felt a warmth, her sister's blessing, her mother's pride. Tomorrow would be difficult. Tomorrow she would face society's judgment, their whispers, their stares. But she would not face it alone. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. Chapter 7. The Duchess emerges. The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, each flame a witness to London society's insatiable hunger for scandal. They had come to see a spectacle, the mad Ravenshaw girl on the arm of London's coldest duke. But Lady Serafina Ravenshaw, standing in her chamber above the gathering crowd, was done being anyone's spectacle. Tonight, she would reclaim her name. Anne, her lady's maid, fastened the last tiny button on the back of Serafina's gown. The dress was exquisite emerald silk that brought out the green of her eyes, with a fitted bodice that emphasized her returning figure and a flowing skirt that rustled like whispers when she moved. Delicate embroidery traced patterns of leaves and flowers along the neckline and hem. Anne had spent an hour on Serafina's hair, arranging it in an elegant style with small diamonds woven through the dark strands. They caught the candlelight, making her look like she wore stars. She looked beautiful. She could see that objectively in the mirror, but she could barely breathe. "My lady, you have gone quite pale," Anne said, concern evident in her voice. Serafina's vision began to tunnel. Her breath came in short, painful gasps. The room spun around her. "I cannot do this," she whispered, her voice rising. "They will all be watching, judging. They will see the madwoman. They will whisper. They will laugh." Her hands trembled so violently she could not clasp the pearl necklace Anne held out to her. "Fetch his grace," Anne said urgently to another maid hovering nearby. Quickly. Serafina sank into a chair, her corset suddenly too tight, the room too small, the weight of what she was about to face crushing down on her chest. Edward entered within moments, still fastening his cufflinks, Margaret close behind him. He immediately crossed to Serafina and knelt before her chair, taking her cold, trembling hands in his warm, steady ones. "Look at me," he said, his voice calm and firm. "Only at me, Serafina." She forced her gaze to his face, to those dark eyes that had first seen her when she was invisible. "Breathe with me," he instructed. "In, out, in, out." He breathed slowly, deliberately, and Serafina focused on matching her rhythm to his, on his face, his voice, his hands grounding her. Gradually, painfully, her breathing slowed. The panic receded enough that she could think again. "You do not have to do this," Edward said quietly. "If you wish, we can cancel the ball, leave London tonight. I will not force you to face them." "No." Serafina's voice was shaky but determined. "No, I am tired of hiding, tired of letting fear control me." She looked at him desperately. "But I am so afraid, Edward. What if I fail? What if I humiliate you?" "You could never humiliate me," Edward said fiercely. "Serafina, you are the bravest person I know. You have survived what would have destroyed most people. One evening, with London's gossips, is nothing compared to what you have already endured." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed Isabella's locket, but it had been cleaned, repaired, the silver polished to a shine. "How did you—" Serafina's breath caught. "I sent servants back to Ravenshaw," Edward explained gently. "They retrieved all your mother's belongings, everything Agatha denied you." He opened the locket, and Serafina saw two tiny miniature portraits inside, one of her mother, one of Isabella. Both faces she loved, both women she had lost. A sob escaped her throat. Edward fastened the locket around her neck with careful hands. "You carry them with you always. Tonight, they walk with you." Margaret stepped forward, placing a hand on Serafina's shoulder. "And so do we. Edward and I will not leave your side for a moment." Serafina touched the locket, feeling the cool metal against her skin, and drew strength from it. "I can do this," she said, more to herself than to them. "You can," Edward agreed. "But remember, Serafina, you do not owe them perfection. You owe them nothing. Tonight is not about earning their approval. It is about claiming your place in a world that tried to erase you." The grand staircase of Ashford House descended into the ballroom in a sweeping curve designed to showcase arrivals. Serafina stood at the top with Edward on one side and Margaret on the other, looking down at a sea of London's elite. The ballroom glittered with jewels, silks, military uniforms, and elaborate gowns. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. The room was packed with aristocrats, politicians, wealthy merchants. Everyone who mattered in society had come to judge her. The major domo's voice rang out. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, Lady Margaret Hawke, and Lady Serafina Ravenshaw. The ballroom fell silent, as completely as if someone had extinguished all sound. Every head turned, every eye fixed on Serafina. The weight of their collective stare was crushing, suffocating. She felt it like a physical force. The whispers began immediately, a susurrus that filled the sudden quiet. "Is that truly her? I heard she was locked away in the country. She looks almost normal, doesn't she? Pretty thing. What a waste. The Duke must be mad himself too." Serafina's legs nearly gave out. Only Edward's arm, firm and steady around hers, kept her upright. "I have you," he murmured so only she could hear. One step at a time, they descended. Each step felt like walking through fire. Serafina kept her chin up, her gaze forward, but she saw everything with terrible clarity. Faces she recognized from her debut 5 years ago, before Isabella's death, before her exile. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, others openly judgmental, their expressions making clear what they thought of the mad Ravenshaw girl. Near the back of the room, Lady Agatha stood with rigid posture, fury burning in her eyes. Edward had insisted she be invited better to face the enemy openly than wonder where she lurked. They reached the ballroom floor. The whispers grew louder, speculation swirling. Edward led Serafina to the center of the room, Margaret close behind them. Then he raised his hand. The room fell silent immediately. When the Duke of Ashford commanded attention, he received it. Edward's voice carried to every corner of the ballroom, clear and strong. Ladies and gentlemen, I present my betrothed, Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw. Seraphina's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Many of you have heard rumors about this remarkable woman, Edward continued. Tonight, I shall correct those rumors. What is he doing? Seraphina thought wildly. Lady Seraphina is not mad. She has never been mad. His words rang with absolute certainty. She is a woman who loved her sister deeply and grieved her loss with honest emotion. She is a woman of extraordinary courage, intelligence, and grace. Society chose to label her grief as madness. Society chose to isolate and judge her for feeling too deeply. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I choose differently. I choose to see her for who she truly is. She will be my Duchess, and I will spend my life ensuring she never doubts her worth again. The shock on faces throughout the ballroom was palpable. This was not how things were done. Dukes did not make passionate public declarations. They did not challenge society's judgments. But Edward Hawke had never been like other dukes. He turned to Seraphina, his voice softer but still audible throughout the silent room. Will you dance with me, Seraphina? Show them who you truly are. The crowd's reaction rippled through the room, shock, murmurs, whispers of disapproval from some corners, but also admiration, respect for Edward's defiance, curiosity about the woman who had captured the cold Duke's heart. Some faces showed open support Edward's political allies, recognizing his courage. Margaret's friends, smiling encouragement. At Edward's nod, the orchestra began to play a waltz. Edward led Seraphina onto the dance floor, and she felt every eye follow them. Her body was stiff with terror. One wrong step, one stumble, and they would all laugh. They would say she truly was mad, that Edward had made a terrible mistake. Look only at me, Edward said quietly. Forget them. It is only us. Seraphina met his eyes steady, warm, full of love and absolute confidence in her. They began to dance. Hesitant at first, Seraphina's steps uncertain, but Edward was an excellent dancer, and he guided her with gentle pressure, making it easy to follow. Her body remembered. Years ago, before tragedy, she had loved to dance. The steps came back gradually, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, turning and swaying. As they moved together across the floor, something shifted inside Seraphina. The room began to fade. The stares, the whispers, the judgment, it all receded into background noise. There was only Edward, only the music, only this moment. She realized she was not performing for them. She was not trying to prove anything to anyone. She was simply dancing with the man she loved. Her expression softened. A small, genuine smile appeared on her lips. Edward saw it, and his own stern features relaxed into warmth. There you are, he said softly. Other couples began joining them on the floor, society resuming its normal patterns, though eyes still watched the Duke and his betrothed. When the dance ended, genuine applause filled the ballroom. Not mocking, but real. Edward bowed to Seraphina. She curtsied in return. As they left the floor, several people approached. An elderly duchess, a formidable woman who had known Seraphina's mother, stepped forward. Welcome back to society, Lady Seraphina. Your mother would be very proud. A young woman near Seraphina's age smiled warmly. You look absolutely radiant, my lady. I am so pleased for you both. Not everyone was kind. Seraphina saw sneers from some corners, heard cutting whispers, but enough people were accepting, welcoming, curious in a genuine rather than cruel way. Seraphina felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had crossed a threshold. She was no longer invisible, no longer exiled, no longer a ghost. She existed, and she had the right to exist. Hours later, as the ball continued and Seraphina had survived countless introductions and conversations, she stepped into a quiet corridor for a moment's respite. She should have known she would not remain alone for long. This changes nothing. Lady Agatha's voice was venomous. She appeared from a shadowed alcove, her face twisted with fury and something else, desperation. You are still the broken, weeping creature I found after Isabella died, Agatha hissed. Playing dress-up in silk gowns does not change what you are. The Duke may claim to love you now, but he will tire of you. Men always do. They grow bored with damaged things. When he discovers what you truly are, weak, damaged, worthless, he will cast you aside. And I will be there too. For a moment, the old fear rose in Seraphina's throat, the old doubt, the old shame. Then she touched Isabella's locket at her throat. She thought of Edward's public declaration. She remembered the faces in the ballroom, not all cruel, not all judging, some kind, some accepting. She looked at Lady Agatha, and for the first time, she truly saw her. Not a powerful tyrant, not an insurmountable force. Just a bitter, frightened woman whose power had come entirely from making others feel small. "You are wrong," Serafina said, her voice steady and clear. Agatha blinked, startled. "I am not mad, stepmother. I never was. I was grieving." Serafina stepped forward, and Agatha actually stepped back. "You made me believe I was broken because it served your purposes. You kept me drugged and isolated because you wanted to control my inheritance. But I am not broken. I am healing." Her voice grew stronger. "And I am done, absolutely done, allowing you to define me." Agatha's face flushed with rage. "How dare you speak to me? You have no power over me anymore," Serafina interrupted, feeling years of fear and submission falling away like chains. "You never will again." Edward appeared at the end of the corridor. He had been watching, staying close in case Serafina needed him, but giving her the space to fight this battle herself. He crossed to them now, his presence imposing, his expression glacial. "Lady Ravenshaw," he said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood, "you are no longer welcome here. Leave, now." Agatha looked between them, Serafina standing tall and unafraid, Edward beside her, united and unshakable. She had lost, completely and utterly. Without another word, her defeat absolute, Lady Agatha turned and left. Edward took Serafina's hand. "Are you all right?" Serafina exhaled shakily, feeling the adrenaline beginning to fade. Yes, I am." "You were magnificent," he said softly, pride evident in his voice. Serafina looked up at him, wonder in her eyes. "I am still afraid of many things, but I am also free." They returned to the ballroom, where Margaret was surrounded by a group of young women, laughing at something one of them had said. She saw Edward and Serafina and smiled, gesturing for Serafina to join them. For the rest of the evening, Serafina talked, laughed, and existed in society. Not perfectly, not without moments of anxiety when the crowd pressed too close or someone's stare lasted too long, but authentically, genuinely, freely. When the last guest finally departed and Serafina returned to her chamber, she did not collapse in exhaustion. Instead, she stood at her window, still in her emerald gown, looking out at London's lights twinkling in the darkness. She touched Isabella's locket and whispered, "I did it, Bella. I stood in the light, and I did not burn." Behind her, in the doorway, Edward watched. This woman would never be exiled again, never be silenced, diminished, or erased. Not while he drew breath, not ever. Chapter 8. The Wedding and New Beginnings. The morning of Serafina's wedding dawned clear and bright, a rare London spring day where the sky seemed determined to celebrate alongside her. She stood at her window, watching the city wake, and thought, 6 months ago, I believed I would die in that tower, forgotten and alone. Today, I become a duchess. Today, I choose joy. The realization brought tears to her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. Margaret and Anne worked together to help Serafina prepare, their movements practiced and efficient but filled with warmth. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of simplicity, ivory silk with delicate lace overlay, pearl buttons running down the back in an elegant line, and a train that flowed like water when Serafina moved. It was nothing like the ornate, ostentatious gowns many society brides wore. It was understated, refined, perfect. Margaret placed a crown of white roses and lily of the valley in Serafina's dark hair, securing it with pins that would keep it in place through the ceremony and celebration. When Serafina finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, though she did, transformed by proper nutrition, rest, and the absence of laudanum. Her cheeks had color, her eyes were clear and bright. But the real difference was deeper. She felt different. She stood differently. She looked at the world differently. The sadness was still there, it would always be there, a part of her as permanent as her bones. But it no longer consumed her. "I wish Mother and Isabella could be here," she whispered, touching the locket at her throat. Margaret stepped behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "They are here, Serafina. They see you, and they are so proud of the woman you have become." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. A footman entered with a letter on a silver tray. "From Lord Ravenshaw, my lady. Just delivered." Seraphina's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Lady Agatha had not been invited. Edward had made that abundantly clear, but her father had received an invitation, though she had not known if he would come. The letter was stilted, awkward, but genuine. My dearest Seraphina, I do not deserve your forgiveness. I know this. I failed you as a father in every way that matters. I allowed my wife to imprison you, to drug you, to steal years of your life. I was weak, and my weakness cost you dearly. I hope that someday, perhaps, you might find it in your heart to forgive me. Not because I have earned it, but because you deserve to be free of the burden of my failures. I have enclosed your mother's sapphire necklace. She wore it on our wedding day. I thought you might wish to have it today. Be happy, my daughter. You deserve every happiness. Your father. Inside the letter was a small velvet pouch. Seraphina opened it with shaking fingers and drew out a necklace of deep blue sapphires set in silver, exquisite, timeless, beautiful. What do you wish to do? Margaret asked gently. Seraphina held the necklace, feeling its weight in her palm. For a long moment, she was silent. I forgive him, she said finally, not because he has earned it, not even because he deserves it, but because I refuse to carry that weight any longer. She fastened the necklace around her throat, something old, something blue. Her internal voice whispered, letting go does not mean forgetting. Isabella and Mother will always be part of me, but I am allowed to move forward. I am allowed to be happy. A flutter of doubt crossed her face. Am I ready for this? To be a duchess, a wife, to face all that comes with this life? You are ready, Margaret said firmly. And Seraphina, you are not alone. You will never be alone again. Anne added softly, you have been surviving on your own for years, my lady. Now you get to live with people who love you. Seraphina straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met her own gaze in the mirror with new determination. Then let us begin. St. George's Chapel in Hanover Square was one of London's most fashionable churches, its interior a masterpiece of architecture, with soaring columns and magnificent stained glass windows that cast coloured light across the assembled guests. The pews were filled with society's elite, Edward's close friends and political allies, Margaret's extensive social circle, curious onlookers who had come to witness the cold Duke marry the supposedly mad Ravenshaw girl. Notably absent was Lady Agatha. Edward had made it explicitly clear she was not welcome. Seraphina stood at the chapel entrance, her arm linked through her father's. Lord Ravenshaw looked older than she remembered, his face lined with guilt and regret. Seraphina, he said, his voice barely audible, I know I have no right to ask this, but may I walk you down the aisle? Seraphina looked at him, this man who had failed her, who had allowed his wife to steal years of her life, who had been too weak to protect his own daughter. She could refuse. It would be justified, expected, even. Instead, she said, yes, but father, this is the last thing I do out of obligation to the past. After today, I build my own future. Lord Ravenshaw's eyes filled with tears. I understand, and I am grateful for this mercy. The music swelled the processional beginning. They walked down the aisle together, and Seraphina felt every eye upon her, but she kept her gaze forward, focused on the altar, on Edward. He stood waiting for her, dressed in formal wedding attire, dark coat, perfectly tied cravat, every inch the Duke. But his eyes held nothing of the cold, remote man he had been 6 months ago. He looked awed, grateful, deeply, completely in love. Seraphina's heart swelled. This is real. This is happening. I am choosing this. When they reached the altar, Lord Ravenshaw placed Seraphina's hand in Edward's with a whispered, Be happy, daughter. Then he stepped back, and it was only Seraphina and Edward, standing before God and society, making promises that would bind them together. The vicar began the traditional ceremony, his voice resonating through the chapel. Ancient words, timeless promises. But when they reached the vows, Edward had requested permission to add words of his own. He turned to face Seraphina fully, taking both her hands in his voice steady but thick with emotion. Seraphina, I vow to honor you, not as a prize or a possession, but as my equal in all things. I vow to see you always, to never allow you to disappear or doubt your worth. I vow to love you in grief and in joy, in darkness and in light, in all the seasons of life that come. I vow to be the partner you deserve, the friend you can trust, and the man who fights for your happiness as fiercely as he fights for his own. Seraphina's own vows, which she had labored over for days, came from her heart. Edward, I vow to trust you with my heart, though it has been broken and mended and learned to beat again. I vow to stand beside you, no longer in hiding but in true partnership. I vow to love you with all that I am, all that I was, and all that I will become. I vow to remind you, as you remind me, that we are more than our losses, more than our grief. We are the life we choose to build together, one day at a time. The exchange of rings followed simple gold bands that would mark them as husband and wife. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto Seraphina's finger, and she felt her own hands shake as she did the same for him. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the vicar declared. You may kiss your bride. Edward cupped Seraphina's face in his hands and kissed her tender and passionate, gentle and fierce all at once. A seal on their commitment, a promise of all the days to come. The chapel erupted in applause, genuine, joyful celebration. As they turned to face the congregation, Seraphina saw Margaret crying happy tears. She saw friends from the engagement ball smiling with genuine warmth. She even saw some of those who had been skeptical looking moved by the obvious love between the Duke and his new Duchess. They walked back down the aisle together, no longer Lady Seraphina Ravenshaw and the Duke of Ashford, but Edward and Seraphina Hawke, husband and wife, partners, equals, Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford. Not just a title, a promise, a future, a choice. The wedding breakfast at Ashford House was elegant but warm, filled with laughter and genuine celebration rather than the stiff formality that often marked aristocratic gatherings. Toasts were made throughout the meal. Margaret stood, raising her glass with tears still gleaming in her eyes. To Seraphina, who taught my brother how to love again, how to live again. And to Edward, who taught Seraphina that she was worth loving, though she always was. One of Edward's closest friends, a Marquess who had known him since childhood, added, to the Duke who defied society for love, and to the lady who proved society spectacularly wrong about everything. Laughter and applause followed each toast. When the dancing began, Edward led Seraphina to the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. There was no fear now, only joy. How do you feel? Edward whispered as they moved together. Seraphina smiled up at him, like I am home, finally, truly home. Throughout the afternoon, Seraphina conversed with guests, her grace and intelligence winning over even those who had been skeptical. She was not perfect. There were moments when the crowd pressed too close and her breath quickened with anxiety. But she handled them. She breathed through them. She stayed present. She was learning to live with her scars rather than be defined by them. Late in the afternoon, as the celebration continued, Edward and Seraphina stole away to his study, a private moment before they would depart for their honeymoon at his country estate. Seraphina stood at the window, looking out at the garden where she had spent so many mornings reading, healing, becoming herself again. 6 months ago, she said softly, I did not believe happiness was possible for me. I thought I would live out my days in that tower, forgotten, lost in a fog of laudanum and grief. Edward came to stand beside her, sliding his arm around her waist. And now? Now I am not just happy, Edward. I am free. She turned to face him fully. Free to love, to live, to be myself without shame or fear. Free to choose my own path. Edward pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. We are both free, and we will build a life together that honors that freedom every single day. Their kiss deepened, tender, giving way to passion, the promise of their wedding night and all the nights to come hanging in the air between them. Seraphina sat in the gardens of Ashford's country estate, a book open in her lap, though she had not turned a page in 10 minutes. She was simply content. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy on the warm air. Birds sang in the ancient oak trees. The sun was warm on her face, and a gentle breeze played with the ribbon of her summer hat. Edward emerged from the house carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, his coat discarded, his sleeves rolled up in concession to the heat. He settled beside her on the stone bench, handing her a glass. What are you thinking about? He asked. Seraphina considered the question. I am thinking that I am happy, and that I am no longer surprised by that fact. Edward smiled. Progress, indeed. I am also thinking about the letter I received from Father yesterday. Edward's expression became more guarded. And he has left Ravenshaw estate, Seraphina said. He has separated from Lady Agatha and moved to Bath. He asked if he might visit us at Christmas. What did you reply? Seraphina looked at her husband. I told him yes. One dinner. He will never be a true father to me. Too much has happened. Too many years were lost. But I can offer him civility. Edward squeezed her hand. You are generous. No, Serafina corrected gently. I am healing. There is a difference. Generosity implies I am giving him something he deserves. I am simply choosing not to carry the weight of bitterness anymore. A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind of silence only possible between two people completely at ease with each other. I have been thinking as well, Edward said finally, about establishing a charitable foundation for women who have been unjustly labeled as mad, who have no resources or protection, who are imprisoned by family members who claim to act in their best interests. Serafina turned to him, her eyes bright with sudden tears. Edward, that is brilliant. I thought you might want to help me manage it, he continued. Your experience, your insight, your understanding of what these women face, it could help so many others escape the trap you were caught in. Serafina felt emotions swell in her chest. Turning my pain into purpose, making something good from something terrible. She nodded firmly. Yes, I would very much like that. They sat together in companionable silence, hands linked, watching the garden sway in the breeze. Above them, a lark took flight, soaring upward toward the cloudless sky. Serafina watched it climb higher and higher until it was just a speck against the brilliant blue. She thought of Isabella, laughing as she chased butterflies through the garden. She thought of her mother, patient and kind, teaching her to read poetry. She thought of the woman she had been in that tower at Ravenshaw Estate, broken, drugged, convinced she was mad. I kept my promise, Bella, she whispered. I am living, truly living. Edward heard her, understood without needing to ask. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. I love you, he said simply. Serafina smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. I love you too. And Edward, thank you. For what? For demanding that I become your Duchess, for refusing to let me remain hidden. Edward shook his head. Serafina, I did not demand, I asked. And you chose. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Never forget, you chose this. You chose to trust me, to leave that tower, to face society, to marry me. You chose yourself, your own happiness, your own future. That choice, that courage was all yours. Serafina leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, the solid warmth of him beside her. He was right. She had chosen. Chosen to trust when trust seemed impossible. Chosen to hope when hope was dangerous. Chosen to love when love terrified her. Chosen to step into the light, even when darkness felt safer. And in that choice, she had found not just a husband, but herself, the woman she had been before grief, the woman she was becoming after survival, the woman she would continue to be flawed, scarred, but whole. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The roses swayed in the breeze. The world continued to turn, indifferent and beautiful. And Lady Serafina Hawke, Duchess of Ashford, once labelled mad, once exiled, once forgotten, lived. Freely, joyfully, authentically. She had been drowning, and someone had noticed, had thrown her a rope, had refused to let her sink. But in the end, she had grabbed that rope herself. She had pulled herself to shore. She had chosen to breathe again, and it was more than enough. It was everything. And so ends the story of Lady Serafina Ravenshaw, who rose from the ashes of grief and exile to reclaim not just her place in society, but something far more precious, herself. If Serafina's journey touched your heart, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up. Your likes help this channel reach others who need stories of hope, healing, and the transformative power of love. Don't forget to subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories for more sweeping historical romances that celebrate courage, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new tale of love conquering even the darkest circumstances. What did you think of Serafina and Edward's story? Did Edward's declaration at the ball give you chills? Were you rooting for Serafina's confrontation with Lady Agatha? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing which moments resonated with you most. If you're craving more Victorian romance, check out the video I'll link in the description and in the cards above. You might enjoy the story of a governess who captures a brooding earl's heart, or perhaps the tale of a bluestocking who matches wits with London's most notorious rake. Remember, Like Seraphina, you are not defined by your darkest moments. You are defined by your courage to step into the light. Until our next story, dear listeners, may you find your own happily ever after. This is Lyra, reminding you that love, real, patient, transformative love, is always worth fighting for.